Is history repeating itself? Well, that's a silly question. Because the answer is fuck yeah. Let's go back 50 years. People are shocked at the price of gasoline. There are lines in front of the gas stations. Inflation is sky high. And it's all because of the political conflict in the far side of the world. Sounds familiar? When we say okay boomer and make fun of how it was much easier for them to be financially stable and that it's their fault that the world is in the state that it is right now, we are actually talking about the 60s. And it wasn't their fault that the economy got way more unfair. It was the fault of the people who governed us, namely Richard Nixon. In 1962, the inflation was 2%. In 1979, it was 15%. During that period, unemployment rate skyrocketed. People had to learn what stagflation meant. The United States President Johnson had escalated the Vietnam War and ramped up social spending. In today's money, the Vietnam War cost $1 trillion. A totally unnecessary war that stole our tomorrows. And that tomorrow was the 70s. Inflation doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process. If you have inflation now, it's because of yesterday's monetary policy. They love to point fingers at what's happening now to explain the inflation. They did that in the 70s and they are doing it now. You just can't spend $1 trillion and not have any consequences. They just wait for the perfect moment to use it as a scapegoat. In the 1970s, that moment was OPEC's oil embargo. Israel and the Arab countries went to war. And the Arab countries got mad at the US for supporting Israel and cut the supply for oil. But the real issue was spending public's money on Vietnam War. Now central banks counter inflation by clamping down the money supply and hiking interest rates, which leads to recessions. When a recession hits, people panic and agree on a lower wage with less benefits, and the bosses are happy. This cycle happens every 10 years or so. They print money to cover their unnecessary spending and corruption. So as a result, inflation rises, they wait to blame on a political crisis, then cut money supply to create a recession. Inflation right now is not because of Russia and Ukraine war. The US only imported 1.4% of their oil from Russia last year. It's because of central banks' monetary policy. It's because they printed an unbelievable amount of money in a very short period of time. And even though they're trying to make it look really complicated, it's actually simple. If you print money, you will get inflation. Printing money is essentially borrowing from tomorrow. And this cheap trick began in the 1970s. Before that, they couldn't print money as much as they liked. After the Second World War, all the representatives from major economies got together in Bretton Woods and agreed on a deal to peg US dollar to gold. It's called the gold standard. So the military-industrial complex started the Vietnam War, used your parents' taxes to fund it. And when the US government obviously ran out of money, they wanted to print more. But they couldn't because of the gold standard. So what did Richard Nixon do? He cancelled the deal bilaterally, even though everyone agreed upon that altogether. He basically said, screw you, and you must buy Saudi oil with US dollars anyways. I can do whatever I want. And he broke the system. What happened next was unfortunate for almost everyone in the world. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer. No more the days of working a few years to buy a house. Inequality got much worse. The whole human progress stalled. Now the owners of the system could do whatever they want. And they did. You see, when you print the money with no backing, the pie doesn't get larger, you just have thinner slices. The greed of the US government and the military-industrial complex created an unsustainable economic model. US national debt is getting bigger every day, and they're not gonna pay for it. Every time they had a problem, they postponed it. Every inflation and deflation policy stole from everyday people who had to live on a paycheck, because the inflation was growing faster than their salaries. So the currency kept losing its value. What we have now is, again, there is a political crisis seemingly causing the increase in gasoline prices. And gasoline is inelastic. You must buy it. When the price of gas goes up, everything gets more expensive. We panic, and while we're trying to survive, we miss out on what happens behind the scenes. What happened before was handing the keys of the economy over to Fed. For nearly 50 years, they borrowed and printed your savings away. Postponed the consequences, but now we gotta deal with those consequences. So what's the agenda now? They're gonna blame everything on Russia. Gas prices, inflation, instability, where in fact it's all because of unnecessary printing of the currency and corruption. What's gonna happen? End of US dollar. The Great Reset. Digital currency. It's not just theory anymore. Just a few days ago, Joe Biden signed an executive order urging the Federal Reserve to create its own digital currency, one that will be centralized. Inflation and deflation with just the press of a button. In the beginning of the 21st century, central banks owned roughly 3% of the economies. When they print currency, they buy stuff with it. Right now, they own almost 33%. 1/3 of the economies belong to the central banks, and they don't produce anything. It's all about control. It's always been all about control. It's a big club, and you ain't in it.